Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Cheyenne Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Cheyenne Hills at CheyenneHills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
Across the street and around the world, Cheyenne Hills.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. And Nathan, welcome back. Kind of a windy day here in Old Cheyenne, at least the day we're recording. And but you came from, I don't know, probably pretty nice place, North Carolina.
North Carolina.
What's it like there?
It was
this time of year
in the mid 70s.
Yeah.
Not a lot of humidity this time of year. It was beautiful.
So I was
and then
gonna
the
say,
wind
the colors. It's vibrant and all that.
You know, it's not as vibrant as it is here right now.
Yeah.
But it still is starting to turn.
No, seriously, this year everyone's commented. This is a unique year for all of Wyoming.
Yeah.
You know, in the 27th of September, I know it well because that was my wife's birthday, and we went to the Snowies. Hit the color perfect. It was just like I've never hit it so perfect before. Yeah. And then really the week later it was perfect when we were up in the around the Vitavu area. That area was beautiful.
I love that place. Yeah, in that river valley that goes through on Happy Jack.
Yeah,
it's beautiful.
It was beautiful. And then so we just had this beautiful fall, and even downtown the avenues have been amazing. And so here in Cheyenne, so yeah, beautiful place. Yeah, so I agree with you. I think we've had as a beautiful fall as anybody.
Yeah, that's great.
So what'd you talk about in North Carolina?
The Lord blessed it. So the main speakers, I wasn't the main speaker. They had Dr. Albert Mohler there and Dr. Erwin Lutzer were the two main guys. And
did you get to talk to Lutzer again?
Oh,
of course?
yes.
Did you?
And then Dr. Mohler. It was just wonderful, just tremendous. And then both of my workshops were full. It was just wonderful.
Good.
And in that really was an expanded version of just a talk. And this is very, very pertinent to our generation. It was an expanded talk on the abolition of man. I started off with just a little bit of the history of 1943. He delivered this series of lectures. He was from Magdalen College in Oxford or Cambridge. I am so scrambled right now on that one. But what he was doing was he was a visiting professor at Durham University.
Okay.
Now, being in North Carolina, I pointed out this is Durham, England. We're talking about.
Okay.
But in 1943, this was the year in which Stalingrad fell. It was 1.3 million people were killed.
Wow.
The Battle of Kursk, which is the largest tank battle in history, potentially the largest air battle in history, 257,000 people were killed in that battle.
Wow.
This was when we invaded Tarawa. This was when Operation Torch was going through North Africa. In that year, he chose, instead of focusing on the world at that point, he talked about something that was of greater danger. It eventually became the opening part of The Abolition of Man, a great book that he wrote later.
Okay.
But it was his series of lectures. And here's the first thing he said: we are not conscious enough of elementary school textbooks.
Interesting.
And he starts going into that subject. And here's the thing: as I was talking about where he was as he's going into the about the second chapter of that book, he talks about how all of this has everything to do with ethics, religion, and public policy.
And when you say he, is that C.S. Lewis?
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis said
Yes.
that in 1943, and he said the most important thing is what's going into our kids' heads.
That's right.
Wow.
He's predicting all that. And so I talked about 4 different ways in which the church has responded to the cultural tide. This was the way I broke it down. Step number 1 was I talked about the way some have responded to the cultural tide is allow themselves to get buried under it.
Yeah.
And I used some illustrations from certain denominations in history that as early as the 1870s began to just bow to the cultural tide, to where today you would not be able to see the difference between that particular denomination and the most rank atheist that you can find.
Oh, wow.
So I was talking about bowing to the cultural tide. The second one, which is the background I come from, the fundamentalist.
There's still bowing going on.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, there's a lot of, what do we call, deconstruction of
That's right.
of even religion of,
That's right.
of what the Bible says. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's good. In response to the way that some have done that, the liberals bowing to the cultural tide, the fundamentalists on the other one, the way I phrased it was they try to run from the tide.
Yeah.
They build bulwarks and bastions and throw rocks over occasionally. And
not our fight.
Right, not our fight.
I've definitely entertained that one.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I would say most of my life. I've just said, I think we've discussed on here is like, especially when it comes to curriculum or some of the things like, I don't know if is that what the church is about?
Yeah,
Is that
I
something we're
understand
supposed
what
to
you're.
be
I
engaging
understand that
in?
sentiment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I've certainly wrestled with that. I'm sorry. That's number 2. Go
That's
ahead.
number 2. The third one was, and I went backwards a little bit in history, about 40 years, to point out that what it seems like many in the church try to do today is to find a cultural Messiah to lift us up and over the tides.
Okay.
And you cannot invest everything into one man or one race. This is something where we have to consistently stand for truth, regardless of what's happening. And we have to do, it's not all invested in one man or one race. And I've watched churches do this. They'll put everything they can into one issue on one year and not realize, no, this is a lifelong.
Examples? Did you give some examples? You have to help me out.
I did.
All right,
Well,
I want to hear what you think.
I'm a huge Reagan fan.
Yeah.
Reagan, and actually I said this in part of my talk. Reagan, of course, he was wonderful in so many different levels. And I talked about how important he was. Many people got behind him, which is really good. And I talked about the fact that when I was a kid, I didn't play Superman so much as I played Reagan. And I'd make my little brother be Gorbachev, you know?
No kidding. You were politically charged way back.
So I remember one time I told them this story, and the first class really got it. The second one, they knew that there was something I was tying to in history, but the first one really got it. So I was talking about how I would be doing something with my brother, and I would say something like, Mr. Moderator, I have decided I will not hold against my opponent his youth and inexperience. Which was, you remember that famous statement? Yeah. The first group got it, and actually it took a while for the group to calm down. It was so fun.
Oh, that's great.
But that's the third one. People looking for, and I mentioned Reagan and then Gingrich and then different people from history all the way up into the present.
Okay.
To talk about, it's not about a cultural Messiah to try to lift us up and over the tide. Here's the role of the church. It's the fourth position. It's to be a lighthouse above the tide, calling people out of it into a place of truth.
Okay.
And so that's where we're actually trying to get people out of that cultural tide, tidal water.
So who's out there doing that in a way that's, I don't know, effective as far as you're concerned?
You and I talked about this a little earlier, but John Stonestreet with Colson
I agree.
Fellows.
For sure.
Oh,
I agree.
You'll look at the way he's talking about things.
Yeah.
He talks about the reasoning underneath it. Yeah. Another guy is Albert Mohler. I have so appreciated Dr. Mohler. And then, of course, Erwin Lutzer. And he will use stuff from history to point out.
Lutzer's been really good for, we've talked about his book in here because he gives that background and the context and lets you see, okay, here's the error.
Right.
That it's just off just a little bit, and then we're reaping the benefits of it being off a little bit here, and now it's way off here. Yeah. Those are three that I certainly know of, but Stonestreet and Lutzer are two that I read, and even Stonestreet, we were just talking about that today.
Right.
Stonestreet's article on that deconstruction of our faith, and I just think it was brilliantly written and very well written, and that's good.
What I like about that is that they are talking about eternal truth. And this is the thing I've been pushing since the very first time I ever ran for office, that it can't be about personalities. It has to be about principles.
Yeah.
Personalities come and go.
That's right.
And sometimes even the immediate issue can come and go, but there are principles that are eternal.
Right.
And so pointing people toward those principles, which is those three gentlemen we just mentioned, they're wonderful at that. And so they become kind of a beacon above the cultural tide, saying, look, this is eternal truth, and this is why we need to think of it from this perspective. Yeah.
And the thing I like about those kind of guys is I may feel like, okay, this is taking a shot at some type of foundational truth of Scripture. And I may understand this foundational truth in Scripture, but they give the background of here's how it's been played out before, because this is not the first time that this issue has come to the surface. This is how it happened in this era, and this is how it played out and the consequences of it. And when you have that context, then you go, okay, this is why the biblical truth of revelation. Right. This is God's revelation to us. It's not some kind of we didn't just stumble onto these words. This
That's
is
true.
God's revelation to us. And so that's where we can put our principle in. And if we don't, then we're going to get off base somehow.
Well, and that really, so this is not a partisan perspective that I'm giving. I'm actually showing a contrast here. So there was a man by the name of Edmund Burke. He lived in the late 1700s. He was actually in the Parliament in England when the American Revolution was going on. But Edmund Burke really is called the founder of modern conservatism. And he was holding up he was showing what was happening on the continent, in France specifically. And he was talking about how ideologues from France were trying to change their calendar, trying to change how people viewed themselves, trying to remake the world in every single way. And his whole point was, in trying to overturn all that we've learned from centuries of history, what you do is you actually put yourself, as you like to say, with both feet firmly planted midair.
Right.
You cut yourself off from knowledge. And really, when he was talking about conservatism, his point was this: there are things from the past that are worth conserving.
Yeah, for
If
sure.
every generation has to remake themselves, then you're always going to be in this position of stumbling and falling. And that's the reason why we learn from history. And that's the reason why history is so important, and books in schools are so important. That's where Russell Kirk, in his book, The Conservative Mind, he points back to all of these people from history and the situations they were facing. And he points out this is why they conserved these truths.
Oh, I see.
And he wrote that in 1953. It's so important.
That is really good. And so one of the things that there's a verse, it's escaping me, but I think it's in Proverbs, and it talks about ancient boundaries. And it's like, before you move an ancient boundary, consider why it was there.
Right.
And I think we've done that. I think we just say, you know what, that boundary, that needs to go. That's ancient. That's old school. That's not, and we need to at least consider, why was that there? Because it could be a conserving a truth that, maybe that's built on a fault line or something. Who knows what? But the idea is, I think a new generation comes in, they just want to, clear the deck. And it's like, well, that's a lot of the deconstruction today. We want to take away history. It's like, well, we've made some major mistakes in our history. Major mistakes, but we've also, or I think we have, learned from those mistakes.
Exactly.
And we're also repeating some of those mistakes.
Right.
And, sometimes I think by throwing out everything, with the baby with the bathwater is the saying we use. But there's a reason some things are in place, and there's some, and we need to remember even the bad things. We need to not do that again.
Right. I believe it was G.K. Chesterton that took that idea of don't remove the ancient landmarks. And he said it this way: when you come up to a fence, before you tear it down, you should ask, why was it built in the first place? And that's one of those things where in our culture where people they want to destroy everything. I was at a meeting the other day and I heard a guy, and it was just pure anarchy, and he was calling for violence, and my heart just absolutely sunk. Because I was thinking, that kind of sentiment, not only is it unchristian, and there is a Christian way. For instance, our founding fathers were not responding in anarchy when they even revolted, leading to the American War of Independence.
Right.
It was. Can we go down a nerd path for just a moment here?
No, good, for sure. I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, so this is called the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates.
Okay.
It comes out of something called the Magdeburg Confession. And the point was this: when it comes to the way in which we revolt, if there has to be a revolt, first of all, it cannot be an anarchy.
Okay.
You have to interpose. There has to be someone that's capable of interposing themselves between the king, in this case, and the subject. And so there is a system of order. This is how you do it. And you do it in such a way that honors God and honors the king as much as possible. And there's a whole way you go about that. It's called the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates. And so, and not only that, it is the duty of the person that is the lesser magistrate to interpose themselves between an unlawful ruler and the people who's trying to subject his people to great harm. It's the duty of the lesser magistrate, but it's never anarchy.
Right.
And all throughout the Reformation, they were very keen on, there are times where you have to stand for truth, but you don't do it in a way where everyone does what's right in his own eyes.
Right.
You stand for truth where you do it in an orderly manner.
Okay, so I've heard of the grievances. Is that where the grievances fit into this picture? That's like 90 some or 70 some grievances or something like that.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because the other night I was sitting at the table. My kids I'm so proud of them, but they were talking about this subject. I was talking about this Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates. One of them right now is learning about the Reformation. And they were learning about the 30 Years' War. So I said, it was my daughter. She's in 9th grade. And I said, well, do you know why the 30 Years' War is so important to us in the year 2021? She said, no, why, Dad? And I talked about the Magdeburg Burke Confession.
Okay.
And so I laid out what the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates was in my 10-year-old. I said, son, what was the purpose clause behind the Declaration of Independence? Can you quote it for me? He quoted the entire first part of the Declaration of Independence.
Wow, that's awesome.
And as he's going through it, it became very clear. It is the duty, when people have been aggrieved,
right.
It is the duty to interpose.
Oh.
And you can see it. And so we tied the Magdeburg Confession with the Declaration of Independence, and my 14, 12, and 10-year-old, their eyes were all just big.
Yeah.
I said, this is how a Christian responds.
Yeah.
It was a fun dinner.
That sounds like a fun dinner. That sounds like good stuff.
I was so proud of them.
Well, and I would say that, in a measured response, I think one of the issues of our day, you mentioned, you started off with C.S. Lewis, and it's been on my heart for a long time. I think back, we had a service outside, so it was like in July, I think, and I made this statement. I said one of the big, I don't know, the attacks, the things that we need to guard our own house, we have to protect our house, is protect the hearts and minds of our kids.
Right.
And I didn't have much, I don't know, really any reason except that just kind of a hunch and maybe some different hearsay kinds of things. And I was like, man, guys, we've got to. I thought that the enemy's attack was on the hearts and minds of our kids. Since then, I've come across a lot of different material that makes me realize, okay, these are some things that some people are going to look at this and go, oh, I don't think that's any big deal.
Right.
And some of us are looking at it and it's like, yeah, here's why I think that's a big deal.
Right.
But I can't make that a big deal for everybody. I can point it out. And so this has kind of been my position on this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm really wrestling to how to deal with some of the curriculum stuff that's going on in our schools here in Cheyenne. I read through some of it. I got some different sources, and I went and met with two different groups. One was the head of the school board, and then two individuals underneath Dr. Crispo in the superintendent's office that have, their hands are all in with the wit and wisdom and what's going on. And I said, I just wanted to have a conversation and say, here's some things I'm concerned about. The main thing that I've read that I'm really concerned about is and teachers have told me this too, that it's dark.
Right.
And I've got some examples, and what I'd like to do, we've kind of expired our time here. I'd like to come back on another session and really kind of go through some of the detail of these things that I perceive to be dark. Now, I'm going to say it again. I don't necessarily expect everybody's going to have the same worldview as I do, and some people are going to read some of these things and go, "Oh, there's nothing to see here. No big deal. I have no problem with my child reading this. That's fine."
Yeah.
I think. This is where I need your input. Sure. This is what I think as a pastor. I feel like, okay, here's some things that I'm concerned about, and here's why. Right. And I think these books or this content right here is dark because of blank. The things that I saw are dark are suicide ideation. There's some books here that have they talk about that. They say, why don't I just stay here and die? Or what if I would drown? And what would the consequences of death would be? It's handled in a way that it's just a little bit, it's unnecessary in the book, in my opinion. But the main thing, and we got to remember, the main thing of this, it's not even the content, it's how early and how young these kids are. That's right. We're talking about second and third graders, that why are we introducing that was my concern. Why are we introducing these thoughts in these kids' mind? I have done 2 funerals of young, children under the age of 10.
Oh, that's a heartbreak.
It is, and it was accidental, but it had there were some questions about, there's another book that talks about putting a rope around this person's neck, and they were just, it's like, I don't even want that image in
Exactly.
my kids, my grandkids'
Right.
minds at all. So maybe I'm oversensitive, and that's possible.
Well, no, your discussion actually brings full circle where we started this conversation with what C.S. Lewis said in 1943.
Okay.
That the way he phrased it was the things that are written about in these books. Many times a young person not even realizing that what they're being introduced to is something that is dangerous for them, it becomes just an underlying assumption. It's an underlying perspective that whether they act on it or not, it's now planted in their minds.
Right.
And that's the reason why this stuff matters. This is our next generation. These are our children.
Well, and this is, you said act on it. It reminded me of the other thing that I'm concerned about. It's not just the content. It's not just the content of these books. It's the of some of the books, not all of them, of course, but it's the way that the teacher's manual has them teach it. And this is what I mean. Teachers have come to me with this.
Yeah.
I've actually seen it on a video. I'll let people. I'll give them the website on that. They can look for it themselves. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is when I was in junior, my wife and I taught what we called the junior high ministry in our church. Okay, you use junior high MYF.
Yeah,
and so one of the things we do, we would teach the stories, the Bible stories, then we would act them out.
Yeah,
and I can guarantee you, when you act out a story of the, of Zacchaeus, or you act out the story of the Good Samaritan, okay, you act out those stories. Those kids drink that in, they get into it, and it's like it is sticky.
Yes,
we really felt like some of our best teaching was, okay, here's the story tonight, and here's two different groups, and they're gonna act out these stories. And I'm telling you, it was the stickiest thing we came across. I don't know, if we invented it or not at that time, or if we read it out of a book, but either way, it was sticky. Well, what I saw when I was going through this and their style, it's like, that's what they're doing. This is a very, very effective way of teaching. And I want to give credit to whoever's behind Wit and Wisdom. They know how to drive a concept in. The question is, what is that concept that's being driven in? So some of these things are, maybe it's just a paragraph in a book. It's like they thought about, dying, just staying there and freezing to death, and no one would know. It's like, okay, no big deal. But it's a concern. It's a concern.
Right.
But the more concern is the way it's being taught is now we're going to have vocab. We're going to do a spelling test and use spelling words out of that. Now we're going to act it out. And one of the options is to act out, and it happens to be that particular scene. That's an option.
Oh, no.
Well, to me, it's like you're taking something and now you're driving it deep, because I've seen how this model is a good model.
That is heartbreaking.
But it's a model that can cut two ways.
Yes.
It can drive something really good deep into a person's soul. It can also drive a concept.
Right.
That, honestly, Nathan, to me, that's why I feel like I've just got to tell parents, listen, this is the content and this is the way it's being taught, or the teachers are asked to be teaching this, and it's going to go deep. It's not going to go over their heads. They're going to drive this deep into their soul. And so you better make sure that you're really okay with the concepts.
Right.
And so it means parents are going to have to get probably more involved than they would.
And I think that's so important. This comes back to, there was a statement from a candidate who's currently running for office for the governorship in Virginia. One of the things he kept pressing on was we should leave the teaching to the professionals.
Okay.
Basically, it was pitting the teacher against the parent.
Oh, wow.
And here's one of the grave challenges that we're facing in our culture today. People believe that the family unit really doesn't matter. And yes, there are broken families. We should point that out. There are broken families, but there are many families that are not broken. And then secondly, if there are conflicts that may come up, should it be a teacher's decision that a child should be learning how to commit suicide, or do they get to exempt the parent from that conversation? These are so important.
Well, I feel like, and this is the part where it goes back to the philosophical, your 4 points. I hope it's a beacon up here trying to, draw people out of a society, or at least expose them to something that I think could be really dangerous. And so that's kind of we'll tackle this next
Yeah.
time. But I really appreciate your wisdom on all these things, and
Yes.
hopefully we can walk through these waters and be good stewards of the information, and hopefully make some parents aware of what's going on.
That's good.
Well, in the meantime, I hope that you will be very strong and very courageous. God bless you all.